Let's observe silence for some time. Oh, Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6. We chant from verse number 25 to 30.
शनैः शनैरुपरमे बुद्ध्या धृतिगृहीतया आत्मसंस्थं मनः कृत्वा न किञ्चिदपि चिन्तयेत् यतो यतो निश्चरति मनश्चञ्चलमस्थिरम् ततस्ततो नियम्यैतत् आत्मन्येव वशं नयेत् प्रशान्तमनसं ह्येनं योगिनं सुखमुत्तमम् उपैति शान्तरजसम् ब्रह्मभूतमकल्मषम् युञ्जन्नेवं सदात्मानं योगी विगतकल्मषः सुखेन ब्रह्म संस्पर्शम् अत्यन्तं सुखमश्नुते सर्वभूतस्थमात्मानं सर्वभूतानि चात्मनि ईक्षते योगयुक्तात्मा सर्वत्र समदर्शनः यो मां पश्यति सर्वत्र सर्वं च मयि पश्यति तस्याहं न प्रणश्यामि स च मे न प्रणश्यति
Last week we covered verse number 25. So the topic 4 starts from verse number 25 to 32. Meditation reveals self in one and all. That's the name of the topic 4. And verse number 25. The main point here is the word Shanai Shanai. Just recapping what we already discussed last week. Shanai Shanai means gradually, little by little, Let him withdraw by the intellect held firm, having established the mind in the self. Let him not think of anything else. So you can't rush into meditation. So that's the first point. Like you have to approach meditation gradually, just as how we approach this class, isn't it? You listen to devotional singing, then we meditate for some time, then we chant few verses from Bhagavad Gita. So it gives us some time to calm down. The mind has to calm down. You you have to change frequency. So it takes a while. So similarly, you cannot rush into meditation. You have to take it gradually. And even if mind slips during meditation, slowly bring it back to the chant of Om or whatever chant you're chanting. The second point was spiritual growth is gradual. It is important for you to understand this. You cannot change your personality overnight. So, no need to get result oriented or frustrated. Just do what you ought to do. The focus has to be on efforts. Never worry about the result. The result is automatic. If your efforts are of high quality, the effect will be of high quality. It's quite straightforward. And when he says, let him not think of anything else, if you read the translation, you will know what I am talking. We're just recapping. See, you need to avoid other thoughts. That is important. Yes, you're attending these lectures once a week, twice a week is great. But in addition to these lectures, spiritual thoughts, you're also entertaining worldly, material, sensual thoughts. Now, the problem is, as far as you are concerned, all of you are concerned, there is some kind of awareness, there is some awakening about what is your life's mission. Otherwise, ignorant people are totally preoccupied with the world. You are also preoccupied. It's not that you're not preoccupied, meaning you're caught up, you are entangled in whatever you are doing. But the difference is there is an awakening. Are you getting the difference? Those who are ignorant, vast majority are totally ignorant, and they are completely caught up in the world. So the word which we are using it, you are preoccupied with the word. Samsara, that is the Sanskrit word. You're caught up in mundane aspects of life, and you cannot come out of that. But the difference between you and others is you are aware. There is awakening, there is some kind of awareness. But in spite of that, you still remain preoccupied with the world, isn't it? And unless and until you put efforts, your sadhana meaning your spiritual journey, your effort, they will not go to the next level. You may remain with this subject for a long time, but in spite of that, your thoughts are not going to shift towards Atman, Brahman, or even consistency in the spiritual path. So, how you have to come out of that preoccupation with the world, that is important. So, for that, you have to tie yourself to some kind of a schedule or a disciplined life. I can't get into the details, so you need to understand the spirit of what I am saying. And for that, your morning study is absolute must. 45 minutes in the morning is must. If you are new to this study, you can start with 15 minutes and gradually you can increase it to 45 minutes. So that too as early as possible within your capacity. So we recommend between 4 to 6, so you figure out what time works for you. So as early as possible without compromising on the rest which you get in the night, isn't it? 6.5 hours, perhaps 7 hours is required. So once you get that fixation, it works like magic, that morning study. Because to get up in the morning and study, you have to go to bed early. 9:30, 10, half an hour here and there is okay. And for that to happen, you need to be disciplined. So we're not saying don't participate in the world, don't go for a party or don't socialize. I mean, to the extent necessary, where it is essential, you may choose to do that. But then you have that timer in the back of your mind. Oh, I have to hit the bed by 9:30, 10 o'clock because I have to get up in the morning. So once you get that fixation, automatically you will be disciplined. This is absolute must. Your morning study, and that too systematic study. You can do haphazard study. Okay, what will I study tomorrow? Verse number 25 of Bhagavad Gita. Day after tomorrow, I will study something else. No, it has to be systematic study. So that thought flow continues day after day, day after day. That is number one, morning study. Number two, your profession is your karma yoga. Whatever profession you are in, you may be in medicine, you may be in law, you may be in sports, you may be in music, you may be in politics. Doesn't matter what you do, that's your profession. So your profession is your karma yoga. So you have to function unselfishly in your profession to purify your personality. So unselfishness at work, unselfishness at home. Meaning you have to do your duties as a husband, as a wife, as a father, whatever role you are playing. So you have to do your duties in the spirit of service and sacrifice. Then also you need to take into account your devotional needs. Each one is different. You may listen to whatever you find inspiring, but it has to be devotional music. So you may decide a particular part of a day where you can listen to devotional music. It may be even while you are driving instead of, it's a useful way. Or you may do it in the evening when you come home for 10, 15 minutes, half an hour. It varies from person to person. You have to take into account your devotional needs. And then other things are quite straightforward. You need to take care of your health. I don't have to tell this to you. Healthy food. By healthy food, I mean which is nutritious and conducive for your spiritual growth. Food makes a huge difference. There is no direct cause and effect relationship, but it is conducive. So healthy food, proper rest, and make sure that you are in satsanga, good company, conducive company. So this is not going to happen overnight. See, what we are discussing is all of you are aware of your goal in life. I'm talking about spiritual goal. There is some kind of awakening. Otherwise, why would you attend these lectures week after week? But in spite of that awakening, that interest, you are still caught up in the world like anybody else. So how you take your spiritual sadhana to the next level, that's the discussion all about. So begin with morning study is absolute must. If you understand the importance of morning study, other things will follow. So slowly, gradually, your thoughts will shift towards your spiritual goal in life. That's what he's telling us. Shanai Shanai. It's not going to happen in a week, it's not going to happen in a month. It needs some time, but you have to start putting efforts. If you don't put efforts, your mere association with this knowledge will not dramatically change your personality. So these are the main points in verse number 25. And he continues, verse number 26, please.
यतो यतो निश्चरति मनश्चञ्चलमस्थिरम् ततस्ततो नियम्यैतत् आत्मन्येव वशं नयेत् यतो यतो निश्चरति मनश्चञ्चलमस्थिरम् ततस्ततो नियम्यैतत् आत्मन्येव वशं नयेत्.
Translation. By whatever cause the unsteady and restless mind, chanchala asthira, wanders away, restraining it from that, let him bring it under the control of the self alone. So, what is telling us that even during meditation, mind may slip from the chant. You're chanting Om, Om, and mind will slip once in a while. So, use your intellect to bring it back to the chant. If intellect is not involved, it will just wander. Will wander away. So whenever you find that during meditation mind is slipping, use your intellect and bring it back to the chant. Number one. Number two, find out the reason why mind is slipping. Possible that something could be bothering you. We are talking about during meditation here. It could be you have some body pain, body ache, maybe the way you're sitting, your posture is not correct. That's what is bothering you. Your mind is getting distracted. So correct your posture. Maybe your breathing is not proper. You're not able to synchronize your breathing with the chant, or the chant itself is not proper. So maybe you can try chanting aloud, or maybe you can try chanting within. So whatever is working for you, but whatever is causing the disturbance, you need to address that. That's what he's telling us. So you need to attend to that. This is as far as meditation is concerned. But the same principle applies to your life. You are interested in this subject, there is no doubt about that. But it's possible that at times there are certain issues which are affecting you, which is causing mental agitations. And unless and until you address those issues or that issue, your mind will not be calm, your intellect will not be clear. You need to address those issues. It could be anything. Maybe something is happening at work, you're not able to deal with that situation. You need to put efforts and address that issue. Maybe you're having some relationship issue at home with your spouse, which is causing mental disturbance over and over again. You need to work on that, resolve that issue. It could be your possessiveness with your children, or it could be grandchildren, due to which you are deviating from spiritual path over and over again. You need to address that. So that's what he says. Whatever is causing that disturbance, by whatever cause the unsteady and restless mind wanders away, address that issue. So it's like you have a sprained ankle. So how can you walk or jog with that? You're health conscious. You want to do yoga, you want to go for a walk or whatever. That you have sprained your ankle. Unless and until you fix it, you address that. I mean, you can't walk, you can't jog. So whatever is creating mental agitations, you need to find out the cause of that. And you need to pay extra attention to it. Using this knowledge, try to resolve that, whatever the cause of that mental agitation is. Point number two. Point number three, if you're not able to stay focused on that ultimate goal, which is very difficult, even from relative point of view, you're not able to be consistent, in your spiritual efforts. You need to find out that you are approaching your spiritual practices scientifically. See, we have been saying repeatedly, everybody needs karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, action, devotion, knowledge. But that combination, the mix, is different for different people. So maybe you're not putting enough efforts in your study, for argument's sake, So you need to increase the time of your study. Maybe once a week is not enough for you. So make it twice a week or thrice a week. Some of you are doing it every day. That is ideal. So you need to make these adjustments. Or maybe your action is not enough. You're lazy. When you have desires, you're just staying at home or whatever. So right from the beginning, Gita is telling us nobody can remain without action. You need to address that. Otherwise, with all your desires, I mean, what will happen? You're not doing anything. You need to make sure that you are addressing your spiritual needs, which is karma yoga, bhakti yoga, and yoga. Also, you may need to put more efforts. Perhaps your efforts are lacking, therefore, you're not getting that focus. Therefore, you're not consistent in spiritual path. Maybe you need more discipline. You're becoming more indulgent in life. You need to address that. Or reduce your unnecessary contact with the world, which creates unnecessary mental agitations. You lose that frequency, isn't it? What is essential, you can't live like a recluse. But if you are interacting too much with the world, then it disturbs your mental equilibrium, because 99.99% people, they are in a very different frequency, isn't it? Worldly, materialistic frequency. Good many of them are self-centered, and you are taking that stimuli day in and day out. So how can you maintain that purity of thoughts and emotions? So what is essential, you cannot avoid. But non-essentials, you need to pay extra attention. If particular company is not good, I think a few weeks back somebody mentioned to me that I go interact with certain group of people, all the time they are discussing politics. And few times there were heated arguments. In fact, it almost came to blows among friends. 10, 15 of them, they meet on a routine basis, day in and day out. This is what they are discussing. And then after that, there is some gossip. I said, I mean, if I were you, I mean, I will not associate with such people. But if you can't avoid, at least you can soft pedal. And unless and until you do that, you can't get that focus. You cannot be consistent in spiritual path. Are you following the thought flow? See, therefore, Bible puts it beautifully. Like the Christ says, Christ as a seeker, you must understand that, not Christ as an enlightened person. He says, why have you forsaken me, God? The very famous words from Bible. Oh God, why have you forsaken me? Meaning, why I'm not in that frequency all the time. So he corrects himself as a seeker, as a sadhak, and then that connection is re-established. And once it is established, it is permanent. Meaning, once you reach that state of self-realization, then that awareness is constant and permanent. But that statement applies to all of us. Oh God, why have you forsaken me? Why my thoughts are not constantly on the supreme reality? Why I'm not able to stay focused on my spiritual growth? Because of whatever we discussed just now. Does it make sense? But that's the challenge. See, the difficulty you and I are facing is mind. So therefore, he says, Asthira and Chanchala. I think it already discussed a few weeks back. So mind has this two qualities, Asthira and Chanchala. It is unsteady and it is restless because of desires. So therefore, mind is compared to a monkey, isn't it? The monkey has these two qualities. Keeps on hopping from one place to another. Within the place, he is very fidgety. Therefore, that comparison. So, such a mind you and I have to conquer. It's not easy. And that's the main meaning in Ramayana. I mean, you don't have to know. It's another epic, the Ramayana, just like Mahabharata is a huge epic, and Bhagavad Gita is part of that epic. Mahabharata is a story. So Ramayana is a story, but without this knowledge, it means nothing. But in this context, it fits. And if you don't know, the story doesn't matter. The message is important. So Lord Rama, he used monkey forces to conquer, to demolish the evil forces. It's all symbolic. So Rama symbolizes self, the supreme reality. And Sita symbolizes the individual, you and me. Sita was taken away by the demon Ravana to his place. So Lord Rama used monkey forces to capture Sita, to defeat the demon Ravana. So he was a prince and Sita was a princess. So they were in a kingdom, Ayodhya. And overnight, they were asked to leave the palace, the kingdom. Next day, he was to be coronated. Somebody plotted against him, and he was sent to a forest life for, I think, 10 or 12 years. So Sita was happy in the luxury of the palace. She was equally happy in the simple and frugal life of the forest, because she was totally focused on Lord Rama. A seeker is totally focused on the supreme reality. Doesn't matter where you are. You may be in best of circumstances, you may be in worst of circumstances. It doesn't make any difference. It's all symbolic. So one day what happened when she was in the forest, she saw a golden fleeting deer, D-E-E-R, deer, which we have everywhere in America. Meaning she succumbed to the senses. This is how sense objects are. They're golden, they are attractive to us. But also they are fleeting, meaning the pleasure which you get from that passes away. So for that fleeting pleasure, we succumb our personality. So she succumbed to that golden fleeting deer. And she told Rama, I want that deer. He went to get that deer as a pet he wanted. And Lakshmana also went, Rama's brother. But before he left, he said, I'm going to draw a line. You better not cross this line. If you cross that line, harm will come to you. It's called a Lakshman Rekha. Meaning, little bit of nonsense you do is okay, you can get away. And then a little bit of indulgent life you have, okay, it's not going to harm you. But when you cross all barriers, you become totally indulgent in life, totally worldly in life, then you lose your moorings completely. Then you are living life just like an animal. Acquire, enjoy, acquire, enjoy. So completely that connection is broken, which produces mental agitations, worry, anxiety, stress, and whatnot. So when she crosses that Lakshman Rekha, that line, Ravana comes, the 10-headed monster comes and takes her away. Meaning you are victimized by your senses. That's the meaning. That when Ravana takes Sita to his land of indulgence, she refuses to live in his palace. He offers all temptations, all money, all whatever you want. But she says no. So she stays in a place called as Ashokavana. It's a forest. Meaning, how do you rehabilitate your personality? That's the meaning. So once that awakening comes, then you follow karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga. You get this knowledge. You live disciplined life. Then when you do that, your desires they reduce. Bulk of the desires are reduced, and you are calm and composed. So therefore, they say Ashokavana. Shoka means sorrow. Ashoka means no sorrow. But it doesn't mean happiness. Shoka is a Sanskrit word. Shoka means sorrow. Ashoka means no sorrow. But no sorrow does not mean happiness. But you are calm, composed compared to other people. But still, you're not with the self. You're not experiencing the bliss of supreme reality. So when you live disciplined life, when you launch on your spiritual journey, with sincerity and dedication, you get that conviction. So Hanumana came. He represented Lord Rama. He's a monkey god. So he came with the ring and gave it to Sita. It's all story. Don't take it literally. So you get that conviction. Initially, it is difficult, but once you plunge into spiritual practice, with determination, dedication, consistency, after a while you get that conviction. Yes, this is my goal in life. This is what I want to attain as a human being. You get that conviction. And then Rama came and he rescued Sita from the clutches of Ravana. I think there is a union between spirit and the individual. You reach the state of enlightenment, but the last last practice was meditation, Agni Pariksha. So Sita, Rama tells Sita to walk through fire. It's all, those who don't understand, they take it literally. The women sleep, they are some crazy thing people are, what kind of a husband he was. And that's not all symbolic. So therefore, I said, without this knowledge, you listen to these stories, goes into absurdity. So that heat of meditation, in the heat of meditation, personality is purified. This is how you conquer a mind which is asthira and chanchala, which is unsteady and which is restless. So that's the challenge all of us are facing, isn't it? And then when you plunge into spiritual practice with determination and dedication, what happens? He tells us in verse number 27. It's just a continuation, it's a thought flow. Verse number 27, please.
प्रशान्तमनसं ह्येनं योगिनं सुखमुत्तमम् उपैति शान्तरजसं ब्रह्मभूतमकल्मषम् प्रशान्तमनसं ह्येनं योगिनं सुखमुत्तमम् उपैति शान्तरजसम् ब्रह्मभूतमकल्मषम्
Verily, supreme bliss comes to this yogi whose mind is perfectly tranquil, whose passion is calmed, who is sinless and has become Brahman. So it is applicable from absolute and relative level. Absolute level, you enjoy, a seeker enjoys infinite peace, infinite bliss, because he has completely annihilated his or her desires. So a prepared seeker, a sincere seeker, he enjoys that bliss. Why he enjoys bliss, why he is peaceful, why he is happy, why he is serene? Because his desires are gone or they have reduced. So the focus has to be on reducing our desires throughout our life. So that's the implication. So when desires are reduced, mind becomes calm and your intellect becomes clear. And also senses do not rush into the world to fulfill desires because your desires are already gone or they have reduced. Otherwise, whole life you are just running after the senses. That is all. The cause is your worldly, materialistic, sensual desire. The cause itself is gone. Where is the effect? Will you run after the toy world as an adult? Very easy for us to understand. So the toy world does not bother us anymore. Why it doesn't bother us anymore? Because there are no desires. So to the extent you get established in the spiritual path, to that extent you become peaceful. Your mind becomes calm. Intellect becomes clear and available. And your senses do not rush into the world to fulfill sensual desires. So that's the effect of verse number 26. Are you getting the thought flow? Just a continuation. There's nothing to explain. The main concepts were explained in verse number 26. So this is just a conclusion. And then he continues. Verse number 28, please.
युञ्जन्नेवं सदात्मानं योगी विगतकल्मषः सुखेन ब्रह्म संस्पर्शम् अत्यन्तं सुखमश्नुते युञ्जन्नेवं सदात्मानं योगी विगतकल्मषः सुखेन ब्रह्म संस्पर्शम् अत्यन्तं सुखमश्नुते.
So 26, 27, he gave us the formula. And he told us that this is what you do, you will reach the ultimate. Now, any seeker has this question, and it's a legitimate question. When will I reach the ultimate? So this verse beautifully answers that query of any seeker. Thus, constantly practicing union with the self, the yogi, a seeker, freed from sin, easily attains the infinite bliss of contact with Brahman. He says easily you can gain self-realization. So he's talking about the time and effort involved in reaching the state of spiritual enlightenment. What is the time? What efforts are involved? So he says it is easy. What's the big deal? So pessimists believe it is impossible to attain the state of spiritual enlightenment. The people who say like, I am ordinary, what can I do? I am too sinful and all that. They're totally pessimistic. They say it's not for, it's not our, it's not my cup of tea. Forget spiritual enlightenment. I can't even give up my basic weaknesses. So what to talk about enlightenment? So that is one view, pessimist. They believe it is impossible to attain that state. Deluded people believe it is easy. You get it? There are two extreme views. Pessimists, they say, I am a gone case. There is no hope for me. Those who are deluded, they say, what's your problem? I mean, the day I resolve, I mean, within few months, I will become Buddha. They don't know what are they talking. The truth lies between these two extreme views. One who has reached the state of meditation, self-realization is easy, as good as reaching self-realization. But to reach meditation, bhunam janmanam, whole life you need to put efforts. But as far as you and I are concerned, consistency in the spiritual path is the key. Sporadic, haphazard efforts will not take you anywhere. Every other class we keep on repeating this, isn't it? You need to be consistent, you need to be systematic, methodic in your spiritual efforts. So, every day morning study, you cannot go wrong. Same formula. And those who are really sincere, see, you naturally your spiritual journey starts with 1 or 2 lectures, so which is great. But then you need to take it to the next level. Otherwise, you will remain preoccupied with the world, already discussed few verses back. So what is that key? I'm addressing this to sincere seekers, and most of you are associated with this knowledge for a long time. So the key is at some stage you need to listen to my guru, Swamiji. I just represent him. How will you listen to him? You can't go to India and do course now, and anyway, he's not teaching there anymore. But what we learn as a student, I learned as a youngster. I spent 7 years. So the entire 3-year course taught by Swamiji is available. It's called as e-learning course of Vedanta Academy. That is the most systematic way to learn this knowledge. What you are doing is okay to begin with. I'm not saying straight away jump into e-learning. If you're not ready, it's not meant for you. But those who have been on the fence for a long time, if you register for e-learning, all you need to do is, these are pre-recorded video lectures, some 450 lectures. You have 3 years to complete. You are tying yourself to a schedule every day. That's the beauty. Now I come across, I don't know, there are some 20, 25 people from Michigan. They are doing that e-learning course. Practically everybody has come to me at some stage and they're saying, I'm lagging behind. So when somebody says I'm lagging behind, I'm extremely happy. So why I'm extremely happy when somebody says I am lagging behind? I'm not a sadist. Somebody is struggling and I am laughing. But it's a fact. I'm happy when somebody is lagging behind. Why?
There should be some tapas, Amiji.
Tapas you're doing, but you're lagging behind, no?
Trying to understand it. It takes time.
That's not, question is not clear.
They know their goal to start with, that this is my goal. And when they are not disciplined, regularly, they know we are not disciplined. That's why it is happening. And that's the main thing.
Good, very good. Yes, somebody else?
They are aware of their deficiencies, they're lacking, I mean, they're trying, but they're not achieving their goal.
Yeah, correct.
They are the people who are between the two extremes you were talking about.
No, correct. I'm talking about now like you're sincere. You're talking about people who are sincere. You tie yourself to a schedule. but you're lagging behind. So when you're lagging behind means you are aware that you're lagging behind. See, otherwise, how does it matter what you do in life? Are you with me? See, when you were in school, college, there was somebody to monitor you. In school, you bunked lectures, teacher will inform your parents. Immediately they will correct you. In university, you did some hanky-panky, immediately the system corrects you so that you stay focused on your studies. But as an adult, who is there to monitor you? Is there anybody monitoring you? So therefore, you are going all out into the world and indulging, acquisition, enjoyment. So now that you are aware, you have understood the importance of spiritual growth. For that, you need to be systematic in your study. But when you tie yourself to that schedule, the moment you lag behind, you understand that something is going wrong. I need to correct myself. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Otherwise, I mean, once a week you attend a class, you miss few classes also, it doesn't matter. Every day you have to study. You miss 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lectures, doesn't matter. But after 10, 15 days, suddenly you understand, oh my God, I was supposed to complete, let's say 15 lectures. I'm still on the 3rd lecture. So I'm saying it is good. That's what makes you put efforts. That's what disciplines you. So those who are really sincere, they have to consider registering for that course. It is a pre-recorded course, pre-recorded lectures given out by my guru, and that's the way to learn Vedanta systematically. What you are doing here is okay. Definitely is far superior to what others are doing, but still you're on the periphery of this knowledge. It goes without saying. That systematic, methodic study is not happening. I don't see anybody doing that except those who are doing e-learning. So that could be a game changer as far as your spiritual evolution is concerned. But anyway, coming back, yes, you are sincere, you want to follow spiritual path, but initial stage is difficult, isn't it? To take that plunge into spiritual journey, initially it is difficult. It's like when you learn bicycle, initially it is so difficult. How many times we have fallen while learning bicycle? Anybody remembers? I don't know, hundreds of times. But after that, what's the big deal? I mean, you can drink Coke and drive and all sorts of stunts we all did. But once you got that technique, so initial stage of spiritual journey is tough. There's no doubt about that. Now, why it is not easy? Because you are going against the trend, meaning everybody is following the herd instinct. Acquire, enjoy, acquire, enjoy, acquire, enjoy. So you're on your own. How can you not do that? It's not, you need that extraordinary conviction not to do that. Right? Everybody is indulging. Whole life they are indulging. If you look at your friends, just for education, anybody, what are they doing? Acquire, enjoy, acquire, enjoy. Having done that, they're indulging in their families now. Oh, I got 2 lovely daughters. Yes, it's great. Why not? Oh, I got grandkids now. Okay, it's like I attend ultimate. This is what they are doing. How can you not do that if you are in that company? So therefore, it's not easy to be consistent in the spiritual path initially. Number one. Number two, sometimes people around you will oppose you or criticize you. Not necessarily in a nasty way. You want to be disciplined. You want to sleep at 10 o'clock in the night. They will say, what's wrong with you? We used to party till 1:30. Now suddenly some crazy idea you got, you want to sleep at 9:30. What is it on Sunday morning you are going for Vedanta classes? such a nice time we used to have, I don't know, playing golf, or we used to sing karaoke together. Now you're living that karaoke and you're going for Vedanta classes. So your own people may criticize you. Are you following what I'm trying to say? Third reason, mind sleeps again and again. So that can frustrate you. 10 times you resolve, no, I'll get up in the morning. 10 times you fail. That can frustrate you. I told myself, no, I will not be indulgent. Still, you will find yourself indulging. So you may find it frustrating to begin with. But once you develop that conviction and your intellect becomes strong, even relatively speaking, then you are consistent. And once you are consistent, then you will take off. So right now, you are not able to take off. That is another way of explaining why you're not able to take off. ABCD, I explained this reason. So once you overcome these initial challenges, the rest of the journey is quite easy. Like bicycling, initially it is very difficult. Once you master that art, what a pleasure it is. So similarly, initial stage is tough, and most people, 80-90% people, they disappear, they give up. Those who remain, 10-20%, they take off. It's a different life altogether once you taste it, once you experience it. That's what it means. Thus, constantly practicing union with the self, the yogi, freed from sin, easily attains the infinite bliss of contact with Brahman. It's a poetry, but what it means from practical point of view, discussed just now. And verse number 29 to 32, they give real test of self-unfoldment. How do you know you are evolved spiritually? So he gives 3 or 4 parameters. It's very important. I may say I am healthy, but when my medical report comes, I go for annual checkup. The medical report does not lie, isn't it? Cholesterol is high, blood sugar is high, thyroid is high, everything is high, and I'm saying I'm healthy. So how do I know I'm healthy? How do you know you are going in the right direction, that you are really spiritual, that your efforts are yielding results? So verse number 29 to 32, they give real test of self-unfoldment. We'll chant verse number 29.
सर्वभूतस्थमात्मानं सर्वभूतानि चात्मनि ईक्षते योगयुक्तात्मा सर्वत्र समदर्शनः सर्वभूतस्थमात्मानं सर्वभूतानि चात्मनि ईक्षते योगयुक्तात्मा सर्वत्र समदर्शनः.
United to the self by yoga, he sees the self in all beings and all beings in the self. He sees the same everywhere. It's poetry. If you try to understand it literally, you will get confused. Your spiritual growth, this is what it means. Your spiritual growth is measured by your feeling of oneness and identification with all beings, period. Sarva Bhutana, all beings. You find out where do you fit in here. Are you able to identify with all beings? Do you feel one with all creatures? If yes, you are on the right path. Their joy is your joy. Their sorrow is your sorrow. So how can you hurt anybody? either physically, emotionally, or intellectually. It's a very powerful test, powerful parameter of your own growth. You may study, you may go on pilgrimages and whatnot. It's okay, it's great what you're doing. In spite of all this, you have negative feelings towards others. I mean, it's a complete 100% failure. This is what we find in many cases. Those who claim they are religious or spiritual, the main quality which comes across when you interact with them is they hate others. What spiritual growth? So authority is saying that your spiritual growth is measured by feeling of oneness. You identify with all beings, just as you identify with yourself. Different parts of the body is you, isn't it? This ear is you, the hair is you, the toe is you, the stomach is you. Something goes wrong to your ear, you nurse it, you don't hate your ear. You have that feeling, this is me. Similarly, your spiritual growth is determined by the feeling of oneness towards all. Mother may have two children, one child is disciplined, other child is not disciplined, but she has same feelings towards both. She may relate to them differently, but internally she feels same. That's what Samuel Coleridge tells us. Can we have that quotation, please? Very useful. He prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. Exactly the same statement. This is what Bhagavad Gita is telling us. Both man, bird, and beast. Somebody may say, okay, man meaning human being, I can identify. What about bird and beast? Are they not your brothers and sisters? How can you hurt your own brother and sister? So you can't bluff. You may think you're spiritual. Apply this formula to yourself. Find out where you are. And when somebody is nasty to you, you're exposed. Everything is going smoothly. I love you, you love me. That's not a test of your spirituality. When somebody is nasty towards you, negative towards you, how do you react? That is real you. When you see negative things happening in the world, could be anything. Could be corporate scams, somebody is misusing their power, political power. We're not saying what is happening is correct, but your reaction shows your real stuff. How could these people do it? That's what we keep on discussing over and over again, that hatred. That shows. Will any parent keep on talking about their children's negative qualities? They may not appreciate those qualities. Definitely, they may try to correct. But imagine parents are discussing negative qualities of their children over and over again. Which parent in the world will do that? Well, you identify with them. But then why are you reacting so differently when it comes to other people? There is no identification. So when somebody is negative towards you, somebody is nasty towards you, you are exposed. And that should not be confused with action. Action level, you need to do whatever has to be done. Otherwise, you'll become like a doormat. This is where people get confused. Just like no mother will tolerate nonsense of children beyond a point. There are so many mothers here. If you don't believe me, ask them. Up to a point, they are lenient, but some day in and day out, they're doing some nonsense. What will any mother do? Mothers, what will any mother do?
you react with the children according to their prakriti. Or
Whatever
what
has
is,
been done.
yeah,
Your child needs a wag, give a
Yeah.
tight wag. Don't take it literally, please. I mean, I'm just giving you as an example. Because we have been brought up on that diet of wags, So definitely it worked. Present day, please don't do it, especially in America. I'll be in trouble. Just understand the spirit of what I am saying. You feel one with them. So that's your real test. And opposite of oneness is feeling of otherness. And when it is pronounced, it turns into negative emotions. Like dislike, hatred, jealousy, anger, rage. Why are you entertaining these emotions? Because there is no identification with others. That does not mean something unrighteous is happening, you keep quiet. It doesn't mean that, but you understand that they're ignorant people. They're not, they're misguided. That is how spiritually matured person relates to unrighteousness in the world. Mentally, you're talking about. So it's there's a direct correlation between your spiritual growth and how you relate to unrighteousness or negativities in the world. Find out, examine yourself, and correct yourself if you feel you are entertaining negative emotions. The first test itself, I don't know how many of us will pass. Advaita Sarvabhutanam. Chapter 12, he says, who is a true devotee of God? Advaita Sarvabhutanam, not hating any being. And so-called devotees of God, they are hating everybody except their own clan. Find out if you are having any feeling of otherness towards others, correct it. As a human being, you are possible. You can do that. You have the capacity. You can't tell a tiger to identify with others. It's not possible. As a human being, it is possible for us, isn't it? I don't know, when you have online lectures, it's very difficult to get reaction. I'm only talking, I don't see any reaction, I think I'm trying my best, I'm doing my job. So let's conclude for today. And yeah, Radha has got a quick announcement.
Good morning, Hari Om. All of you must have received an email about supporting the Vedanta cause. Twice a year we send this email. You must be aware of our study classes, which are offered throughout the year, and public lectures. These are all free for all and open to everyone. But there are expenses involved to sustain this cause. For example, teachers' personal, travel, and medical expenses, online promotions to bring awareness to this knowledge in the Midwest area, and the property maintenance. Email mentions all these points in detail. Please go through that. You can contribute to this cause as per your inspiration. Thank you.
See you next week, all of you.
Thank 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 you, Amitji.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Amitji.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you.
Hari Om.
I have a question. Is it possible we can listen to the previous classes, lectures that have been recorded?
Oh, yeah, sure.
How do we
Just
do
send
this?
us an email. In fact, that's what we are going to discuss after the lecture. I mean, the coordinators. That all of you should get access to that
Yeah, the previous class.
playlist, so that
Sometimes-
you don't have to send email to us again and again. So we're going to work on that. But just for this week, please send us an email
Okay.
And the coordinator will give you access to the previous lecture.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amitji.
Good
Thank
day,
you.
all of you.
Hari Om.
Hari Om, Hari Om.
Lady picture.
So we are concluding for today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Where is Vijay?
He was not here today, Amiji.
Because Vijay was supposed to be here. He is the main person. He only
I
reminded me
attended,
yesterday.
Amitji. Let me call.
I think he forgot about the meeting. Last night he called me to remind me about this meeting. I had forgotten, frankly.